This chat is intended as a bit of an introduction to restumping, what restumping is, why and when you might restump, some of your options, and I'd like to give a bit of the theory behind restumping to help you with the choices and future maintenance of your site. Typically, houses in Queensland have been built on pier foundations. This made sense, especially in the old days, because it didn't require levelling of the ground, which is difficult without an excavator. It was only necessary then to dig a number of holes. These holes weren't dug any deeper than necessary either, because they were being dug with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. There were two reasons to even put them in the ground rather than just leave them on the surface. One which was quite obvious to the builders at the time, which was when a wind would come, if the posts were on top of the ground, the house would easily blow over. The other one was that the deeper you went, normally the more stable the soil conditions. The soil generally improves. You get out of the organic humus layer on the surface and into more competent material. But also, there's an effect called the depth of influence. At a certain depth, which is governed more by climate, when the rains occur and how much rain occurs, rather than the soil, there's a depth at which the soil conditions vary very little. In Brisbane, it's probably 1.5 metres. In Ipswich, maybe 2.2. And in Dalby, it can be many metres. In practice, when you're digging the hole with a shovel and there's no building codes or standards to comply with, the post holes were 2 to 3 feet deep, 6 to 750 mils, sometimes 900 millimetres in bad soils. This led to a certain amount of movement in the house. One problem is that a post foundation system, almost by definition, can never provide a perfectly level house. The posts in the centre see less rain than the ones on the outside, so there's a continual drying and a shrinkage of the soil here. The reason that the soil moves with the amount of water in it has to do with the clay content. Clay is a bundle of very flat particles, and when water is drawn into them, they have a high surface area and they expand quite a lot. So it can be expected on a high clay soil that the area underneath the house will sink considerably more than the perimeter. And one would expect to find that over an extended period, the floor of the house would develop a little bit of a curve like that. In practice, it's probably more commonly found that the floor curves the other way, and that's probably gravity playing its part as well. The centre of the house is stable. The perimeter posts are going up and down with the seasons, with the wet season and the dry season. And when you pull something in and push something out hundreds of times, if you've got gravity acting as a big spring in one direction, the posts tend to drop more. Also, one reason why the posts fail is because they tend, if they're timber posts, to go pencil-ended due to the action of the fungus. The posts in the middle are generally in better condition because they're in a drier material. The posts at the edge tend to see more moisture, more fungus, go more pencil-ended and tend to head down. The first question then when you're restumping is, do you really have to? It's often quite practical just to go through with a car jack and a water level and place some spacers underneath the ant capping and bring the house back to level. That certainly is a serious option if your house is out by, say, 50 millimetres. If it's out by 1, 2, 3, 400 millimeters, then it may not be a practical idea. Also, when the load goes back on the house, you may be putting the load on a pointy stump and it'll just dip under the weight. So having decided that you want a restump, what are your options? It really comes down to the choice of posts. Typically, it used to be timber. They're hardly used anymore. Only really in heritage buildings, and then really only in visible locations. The best post is probably the old square concrete post. It's the most stable, it damps the movement in the house, and it has potentially the longest life. Problem is, the younger generation, being what it is, are very reluctant to install these, and the steel posts have become by far the most common solution. They've got a lot of advantages. Easier to install, easier to fix things to, possibly easier to adjust. The disadvantage is that the house may vibrate more, and if it's not properly treated around the interface between the stump and the concrete, they can rust out in that location, which is really tragic. It's almost a throwaway. The stump time, it's very difficult to repair that. But with minimal precautions, that problem can be overcome. That would be your basic restump, leaving the building at the same level. Of course, at the end of the day, you're only better off in your own head, because the neighbours can't see that you've spent a lot of money on a flash restump. All it is now your doors open and close properly, your back door closes, whether it's the summer or winter, and the house is much nicer to live in. Whenever people restump, they should also consider what else they can do at the time. Even if they reject the idea, it's much better to consider that before, rather than regretting later on. So there's a few things you can do. A very common one these days is to raise the house. Real estate prices being what they are, it's much better to have a 200 square metre house than the original 100 square metre house. What you do down here has a couple of options. One is you could just put in a non-structural slab between the stumps. That's much better for a workshop or a ping pong table, or to park a car on top. And it adds some value to the house. Another thing you might do is reduce the number of stumps you have by putting in some steel beams. The beam costs a little bit more than the stump you replace, but it adds a whole dimension to what you can do with the space underneath. What has to be kept in mind, though, is that this building will still go out of level over its life. It's then a matter of thinking, what other options are there? If you're in a poor soil and you would like to never have to restump again, you may consider the option of a structural slab. The structural slab is simply the same as the 100mm non-structural slab that you might have in a non-habitable area under the house, but trenches called thickening beams are added underneath it in a waffle pattern to stiffen it. The house no longer sits on pier foundations. It now sits on the slab, which is often called a raft slab because it floats on the soil. This opens up a whole new world in options. You can now have a habitable area underneath the house. You can, for example, build a wall with windows and enclose the building. It's not practical with a non-structural slab because the slab's moving separately to the house and there's the risk of the wall buckling. You can move Granny underneath the house. She wouldn't have been happy in a non-structural house because she would have faced issues of moisture coming through the floor and causing her arthritis to act up. She also would have been calling you constantly downstairs to fix the architraves, which keep falling down because of the buckling of the walls. Another common solution is to move the kitchen downstairs. Makes a lot of sense because if you analyse your movements, the bulk of what we do in a house is carrying groceries from the car to the kitchen and from the kitchen to the wheelie bin. So it certainly adds a lot of utility to a house if we have the kitchen downstairs. Raising a house can be very tempting, especially when you hear that the cost of the raise is very little and sometimes almost nothing in the case of very low houses, which can't be practically restumped and have to be just raised to be restumped anyway and then lowered back onto the original stumps. And that's true. The cost of a raise is relatively very cheap. The problem is we're all greedy and other things come and other issues arise as well. For one thing, your stumps, your stairs aren't going to make it to the ground floor anymore. You're probably going to want to have a deck out here, which is going to cost you money as well. That bathroom that was quite serviceable upstairs isn't nearly good enough for somebody with a big flash raised house, and it's easy to spend $20,000, $30,000 on a bathroom or on a kitchen. So at the end of the day, this process can be quite expensive. In some ways it doesn't have to be because it can also be staged. You might be faced with the unpleasant conclusion that you've got to restump your house, and you may want to do it in a way that increases the value of the house, but you may not want to build in yourself. So then all you're up for is extending the stairs, and you can leave the bottom level open. And hopefully when you go to sell the house, the real estate agent points out that this house can be built in underneath and it's considerably worth more than the house next door. Other things to think about, whether you restump or build in, is water flow. Many of the problems of a house were caused by the fact that water was ponding around the footings. That's something that makes sense to remedy at the time when the house is being restumped. So I hope that clarifies some of the issues around restumping and the options that you have when you do it.